The small town of Oakwood, nestled in the Midwest, welcomed the break of dawn with a quiet stillness. Dr. James Whitmore, a highly regarded surgeon and a man with a heavy heart, stood in his modest kitchen. The pale morning light filtered through the sheer curtains, catching the steam rising from his freshly brewed coffee. As he buttoned his crisp white lab coat, the warmth of the mug in his hand did little to thaw the cold ache that had made a home in his chest for years. Across the room, on a weathered shelf, stood a picture frame that had refused to let go of his gaze. In it, he saw himself, his late wife Caroline, and their precious daughter, Emma. The photo was taken during happier days. Emma, barely 4 years old, beamed with innocent joy, clutching her favorite stuffed bear. James could almost hear her laughter, her voice calling for him to join her in one of her endless games. Next to it was a more recent photo, James on his second wedding day, standing beside his new wife, Martha. Martha's poised smile and perfectly coiffed hair contrasted starkly with the candid happiness frozen in the earlier image. He sighed, setting the coffee down, the weight of memory pressing harder than usual this morning. "Heading out already?" Martha's voice floated in from the hallway. She entered the room, immaculate as always, her soft cardigan draped elegantly over her shoulders. "Yes, it's a full day," James replied, keeping his tone neutral. Martha smiled, though it seemed more out of habit than affection. "Don't forget, we have the dinner party on Saturday. The Walkers are bringing their son, you know, the one studying law at Harvard." James nodded distractedly. "I'll be there." The conversation ended with a polite goodbye as James stepped out into the chilly air. His car, a reliable but aging sedan, was parked in the driveway of their well-kept suburban home. The neighborhood was pristine, every lawn neatly trimmed, the houses uniform in design. Yet, to James, it felt devoid of life, a facade of perfection masking a lack of genuine connection. The drive to the hospital was uneventful. At Mercy General, James moved through the bustling halls with an air of calm competence. Colleagues greeted him with a mix of respect and familiarity, though they knew better than to delve too deeply into his personal life. "Dr. Whitmore, the first procedure is prepped," a nurse informed him as she fell into step beside him. "Thank you, Susan," James replied, his tone measured and professional. In the operating room, James became the picture of precision. His hands worked methodically as he performed a delicate cardiac surgery. The room was silent except for the rhythmic beeping of monitors. Every member of the team focused entirely on the task at hand. For James, the operating table was a sanctuary of sorts, a place where his mind could shut out the noise of grief and focus solely on saving lives. Later, he sat across from a nervous couple in his consultation room. Their 8-year-old son needed a complex procedure, and the fear in their eyes was palpable. "This is a challenging surgery," James explained gently. "But I've performed it successfully many times. Your son is in good hands." The mother's lip quivered as she nodded, and the father reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. James offered them a reassuring smile, though his mind wandered briefly to a time when he and Caroline had sat in similar chairs, clinging to hope for their own child. By mid-afternoon, James had a brief moment to himself in the hospital lounge. Dr. Rachel Pierce, a younger colleague, approached him, her face lit with admiration. "I heard you'll be volunteering at the Pine Hollow Clinic again this weekend," she said. James nodded. "I try to make it out there whenever I can. They don't have the resources we do here." Rachel smiled. "It's inspiring, you know, the way you give back." James waved off the compliment, uncomfortable with the praise. For him, the clinic wasn't about heroism. It was about finding purpose, a way to fill the void that his professional success couldn't. The day stretched on, and by the time James pulled into his driveway, the sky had turned a dusky orange. The aroma of roasted chicken wafted from the kitchen as he stepped inside. Martha greeted him with her signature glass of wine in hand. "You're home later than usual," she observed, though her tone was more curious than accusatory. "Long day," James replied simply. Martha gestured to the dining room, where the table was set with meticulous attention to detail, I made chicken marsala, your favorite. Thank you, he said, sitting down across from her. As they ate, Martha began discussing plans for redecorating the living room. Something brighter, more modern, she suggested, watching him closely for a reaction. James nodded absently, his mind elsewhere. Memories of Emma in that very room came rushing back, her tiny feet padding across the floor as she played hide-and-seek, her laughter echoing against the walls. I need to go over some patient files, he said abruptly, rising from the table. Martha's eyes narrowed slightly, but she masked it with a practiced smile. Of course. Let me know if you need anything. In the quiet of his study, James sank into his chair, his head in his hands. The photograph of Emma on his desk seemed to stare back at him, her eyes full of life and promise. He had promised himself that his grief wouldn't consume him, yet here it was, a constant companion. The sun peeked over the horizon as James prepared for his trip to the Pine Hollow Clinic. His medical bag, meticulously packed the night before, sat waiting by the door. Martha, already dressed in her tailored slacks and silk blouse, sipped her coffee at the kitchen counter. You know, she began casually, we should consider a getaway. Maybe that resort in Hawaii we talked about last year. The fresh air would do you good. James zipped up his bag without looking at her. Maybe, he said, his tone non-committal. Martha tilted her head, her gaze sharp. You spend so much of your free time at that clinic. It's admirable, of course, but don't you think it's time to focus more on us? I'll think about it, James replied, offering her a faint smile before heading out the door. The Pine Hollow Clinic stood on the outskirts of the county, its humble structure a stark contrast to the state-of-the-art hospital where James spent most of his days. The peeling white paint and cracked windows gave it a weathered charm, but it was clear the clinic relied on the goodwill of volunteers and donations to keep its doors open. Dr. Marcus Reed, the clinic's long-serving physician, greeted James with a firm handshake. Whitmore, always good to see you. Hope you're ready. We've got a packed day ahead. James nodded, following Marcus inside. The waiting room was already full, with families from nearby rural areas sitting patiently. Children played with mismatched toys in a corner while their parents filled out forms. In the examination room, James worked through patients with quiet efficiency. A young boy with a persistent ear infection, a woman with a sprained wrist, an elderly man in need of a diabetes check, all received his undivided attention. During a brief lunch break, Marcus joined him outside, unwrapping a sandwich from wax paper. You know, Marcus said between bites, we've been seeing more kids from group homes lately. A lot of them are shuffled between counties. Some come from pretty rough situations. James frowned, setting down his coffee cup. Group homes. Marcus nodded. Orphanages, foster care, you name it. It's heartbreaking. Some of these kids barely speak when they first arrive. The words struck a chord in James. He knew what it was like to lose a child, to carry the weight of absence. But these children, most of them didn't even have memories of love or family to hold on to. The afternoon sun filtered through the clinic's windows as James continued his work. He was examining a young boy with scraped knees when he noticed her. A girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, stood in the doorway, her dark hair framing a pale, solemn face. She clutched the hand of an older woman, her caretaker, whose stern expression softened as she gently nudged the girl forward. James smiled warmly. Hello there. Come in. Let's take a look. The girl hesitated, her wide eyes darting around the room before she climbed onto the examination table. Her caretaker hovered protectively nearby. She had a fall, the woman explained. Just a scrape, but I thought it best to have it cleaned. As James gently cleaned the cut on the girl's arm, his gaze caught on something around her neck, a necklace, a ruby pendant. The world seemed to tilt. His hands froze, the antiseptic swab hovering mid-air. The necklace was unmistakable, deep red, intricately set in gold, with a tiny chip on one edge. He had given it to Emma for her birthday, an heirloom passed down through his family for generations. It was buried with her. Where did you get that necklace? James asked, his voice tight. The girl glanced at him, startled by the urgency in his tone but said nothing. The caretaker stepped in quickly, her expression guarded. "It was a gift," she said curtly, tugging the girl's sweater up to hide the pendant. "Wait," James began, his heart pounding. "I just need to—" "We really have to go," the caretaker interrupted, already gathering the girl's things. Before James could stop them, they were gone, disappearing into the crowded waiting room and then out the clinic doors. He stood frozen, the image of the necklace burned into his mind. That evening, James sat in his study, the room dark except for the glow of his desk lamp. Spread before him were documents he hadn't touched in years: Emma's death certificate, the accident report, and the coroner's notes. His surgeon's precision, once dulled by grief, now dissected every detail with clinical detachment. The accident report listed a time that didn't align with his memories. Emma's death certificate had inconsistencies in the signatures, and the coroner's notes, the ones he had skimmed at the time, unable to face the finality, mentioned an unidentified witness whose name was conspicuously missing from the official report. The next morning, James made phone calls. One to the hospital administrator who had overseen Emma's care that night, another to the officer who had investigated the accident. Each call yielded the same results: vague answers, forgotten details, and an overwhelming sense that people were eager to move on. But James couldn't. He drove to Cassandra's house that afternoon. It had been years since he'd seen his ex-wife. Their marriage had crumbled under the weight of their grief, and their separation had been as quiet and restrained as their life together once was. Cassandra opened the door cautiously, her eyes widening when she saw him. "James," she said, her voice a mixture of surprise and guardedness. "Cassandra," he replied, "I need to talk to you. It's about Emma." She hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. Inside, James noticed the faint scent of lavender and the familiar warmth of the home they had once shared. On a side table was a framed photo of Emma, her bright smile immortalized in glossy paper. "What is this about?" Cassandra asked, her arms crossed. James hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "I saw a girl yesterday," he began. "At the clinic. She was wearing Emma's necklace." Cassandra's expression froze, her eyes narrowing. "That's not possible. The necklace was buried with her," James finished. "I know, but I'm telling you it was the same necklace." Cassandra sank into a nearby chair, her face pale. "Are you sure?" "Positive," James said firmly. For a long moment, neither spoke. The weight of what James had said hung heavily in the air. "I always felt," Cassandra began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I always felt there was something we didn't know about that night. The way they rushed us through the funeral arrangements, the way they insisted on closed casket." James sat across from her, his heart racing. "I think they lied to us," he said. Cassandra nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The air outside Cassandra's house was heavy with the scent of rain, the clouds above threatening to spill. James leaned against his car, his hands gripping the cold metal of the door as he tried to gather his thoughts. Cassandra's words replayed in his mind. The way they rushed us, the closed casket. Every step of their tragedy, every decision, suddenly felt suspicious. For years, James had accepted the narrative they'd been given: Emma's accident, her death, the funeral. But now it was unraveling before him like a poorly constructed tapestry. He climbed into the driver's seat and glanced at the list of names and numbers he'd scribbled in his notebook. One name stood out: Officer Grace Holloway, the lead investigator on Emma's accident. She had retired a few years ago, but James had managed to track down an address. If anyone knew why certain details of the case didn't add up, it would be her. The drive to Grace's home took James to the outskirts of the city, where the houses were modest and well-loved, each one with its own unique charm. He parked in front of a brick bungalow with a neatly trimmed hedge and flower pots lining the porch. When the door opened, Grace Holloway stood before him, her silver hair cut short and her sharp blue eyes studying him carefully. She looked like someone who had spent a lifetime discerning truth from lies. "Doctor Whitmore?" she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Yes," James replied, extending a hand. "I know it's been years, but I need to talk to you about my daughter Emma's case." Grace's expression softened slightly, and she stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, her home was cozy but simple. Photographs of family and friends adorned the walls, and the faint aroma of brewed coffee lingered in the air. Grace gestured for James to sit at the small dining table, and a moment later, she placed a mug of coffee in front of him. "What's on your mind?" she asked, sitting across from him. James hesitated before speaking. "I've been looking over the accident report, the death certificate. There are inconsistencies, things that don't make sense." Grace's brow furrowed and she leaned back in her chair. "What kind of inconsistencies?" "The timing on the report doesn't match when I remember the accident happening," James explained. "And the death certificate, it has errors, incorrect signatures, inconsistencies in the formatting." Grace's lips pressed into a thin line and she nodded slowly. "I remember Emma's case," she said, her voice quieter now. "It was unusual." James leaned forward. "Unusual how?" "There was pressure," Grace admitted, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "From higher-ups. They wanted the case closed quickly. It didn't sit right with me, but I was told to let it go." "Pressure from who?" James pressed, his voice rising. Grace shook her head. "I can't say for sure, but it wasn't just the department. It felt bigger than that, like someone didn't want us digging too deep." James stared at her, his heart pounding. "Do you think Emma could still be alive?" Grace hesitated, then met his gaze. "I don't know, but I think you're right to ask questions. Something about this case never felt right to me, either." James left Grace's house with more questions than answers. The threads of the mystery were becoming clearer, but they still didn't form a complete picture. As he drove back to the city, his mind raced. He needed to track down the caretaker from the clinic, the woman who had hurried the girl with the ruby necklace out the door. Marcus's vague directions to the orphanage near the county border were his only lead. The drive to the orphanage took him deep into rural farmland. The paved roads gave way to gravel, and the landscape became increasingly desolate. Finally, he spotted a weathered wooden sign half hidden by overgrown grass. Hope Haven Orphanage. The building itself was a large 3-story structure that had clearly seen better days. Its faded white paint was peeling, and several of the windows were boarded up. A rusty swing set creaked in the wind, and the entire property exuded an air of neglect. James parked his car and approached the main entrance. Before he could knock, the door opened, and a woman in her 60s with a no-nonsense demeanor stepped out. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. "I'm Dr. James Whitmore," he said, extending a hand. "I volunteer at the Pine Hollow Clinic. I think one of your wards was there recently, and I had some questions about her care." The woman, who introduced herself as Sister Margaret Hall, regarded him with cautious curiosity. "We do send some of our children to Pine Hollow," she said. "Which child are you asking about?" "A little girl named Mia," James said, his voice steady. At the mention of the name, Sister Margaret's expression tightened. She folded her hands in front of her, her polite demeanor giving way to guardedness. "I'm sorry, Doctor Whitmore, but I can't discuss the children in our care. Privacy policies, you understand." James took a deep breath, trying to keep his frustration in check. "Sister Margaret, this is important. The girl was wearing a necklace that belonged to my daughter. My daughter who passed away years ago." Sister Margaret's eyes flickered with something, sympathy, perhaps, or hesitation. But her lips remained pressed into a thin line. "I'm sorry for your loss, but I can't help you." James's shoulders sagged, but he wasn't ready to give up. "Please," he said, his voice softer now. "If you know anything at all, it could help me find answers. Answers I've been searching for since the day my daughter died." Sister Margaret hesitated, her gaze darting to the building behind her. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Wait here." She disappeared inside, leaving James standing on the creaking porch. Minutes later, she returned with a small, worn notebook in her hands. "I shouldn't be showing you this," she said, glancing around nervously. "But I can't ignore a father's grief." James took the notebook and opened it. Inside were names, dates, and notes about the children who had passed through the orphanage. His eyes scanned the pages until he found what he was looking for. Mia R. Arrived June 12th. Guardian, Helen Parker. Helen Parker, the caretaker from the clinic. "She's been Mia's guardian for about 6 months," Sister Margaret explained. "But I don't know much about her. She doesn't share details and we don't ask." "Do you have an address?" James asked, his voice urgent. Sister Margaret hesitated, then nodded. She scribbled an address on a scrap of paper and handed it to him. "Be careful, Doctor." Whitmore. "Sometimes the truth isn't what we want it to be." James drove away from the orphanage with the address clutched tightly in his hand. Helen Parker's name and location felt like the missing puzzle piece he'd been searching for. Yet a heavy sense of dread settled over him. As he pulled into his driveway that evening, the porch light illuminated Martha waiting by the door. She looked serene, but James noticed the tension in her posture, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're late," she said, her tone light but probing. "It was a long day," James replied, brushing past her. In the kitchen, Martha set down her wineglass and crossed her arms. "You've been distracted lately. Is something going on?" James turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I'm looking into Emma's case again." Martha's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "James, we've been over this. What happened to Emma was a tragedy, but it's in the past. You need to let it go." "I can't," James said simply. Martha stepped closer, her voice soft but tinged with steel. "You won't like what you find if you keep digging." Her words sent a chill down James's spine. James couldn't sleep that night. Martha's words lingered in his mind. "You won't like what you find if you keep digging." The way she had said it wasn't just a warning. It felt like a veiled threat. He sat in his study, the scrap of paper with Helen Parker's address sitting on his desk like a burning question. He thought about confronting Martha directly, demanding answers, but something held him back. If she knew more than she was letting on, forcing her hand might only push her deeper into secrecy. Instead, he focused on the next step. Helen Parker. She held the key. The address led him to a quiet, unremarkable neighborhood on the other side of the city. The houses here were smaller, older, with yards that were neatly maintained but showed signs of wear. Helen's house stood out only in its simplicity, a single-story home with a sagging porch and faded shutters. James parked down the street and approached cautiously. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but his heart pounded with anticipation. The door creaked open after the second knock, revealing Helen Parker. Her expression instantly shifted from curious to wary when she saw him. "Dr. Whitmore," she said, her voice guarded. "I need to talk to you," James said. "It's about Mia." Helen's eyes flickered with recognition, but she quickly masked it. "I'm sorry, but I don't know what you're talking about. You'll have to leave." Before she could close the door, James stepped forward, his voice firm but not threatening. "Please, Helen, I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to understand." Helen hesitated, her hand still on the doorframe. Finally, she sighed and stepped aside. "Come in." The inside of the house was sparse but clean. A few mismatched pieces of furniture filled the living room, and a pile of children's books sat neatly on a coffee table. James followed her to the small kitchen, where she gestured for him to sit at the table. "You've got 5 minutes," she said, crossing her arms. "Mia was wearing a necklace at the clinic," James began. "A ruby pendant. It belonged to my daughter, Emma, who died 4 years ago. That necklace was buried with her." Helen's face betrayed nothing, but her grip on the back of the chair tightened. "I just need to know where she got it," James continued. Please, if there's even a chance that... His voice faltered, the weight of the words too much to bear. That my daughter is still alive. Helen finally sat down, her expression unreadable. I can't tell you much, she said slowly, but I can tell you this. Mia isn't an ordinary orphan. She was placed in my care by people who didn't want anyone asking questions. I was told not to look into her past and not to ask where she came from. Who gave her to you? James asked urgently. I don't know their names, Helen admitted. It was all very informal, but they seemed powerful, connected. James leaned forward. What about the necklace? Did they say anything about it? Helen shook her head. It was already hers when she came to me. She never takes it off. Before James could press further, the sound of footsteps interrupted them. He turned to see Mia standing in the doorway, clutching a stuffed rabbit. She looked at him with wide, curious eyes, and James felt his breath catch. Mia, Helen said gently, rising from her chair. Go back to your room, sweetheart. Mia hesitated, her gaze lingering on James, before nodding and retreating down the hall. I think you should leave now, Helen said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. James stood, his mind racing. Thank you, he said. If you think of anything else, please. But Helen was already guiding him toward the door. James spent the next few days piecing together everything he had learned. He spoke again with Cassandra, who had found more old documents from the accident, including an insurance claim filed under a company he didn't recognize. The company, Northfield Holdings, turned out to be a shell corporation with no clear connections. The trail led him back to Martha. One evening after dinner, James confronted her. I need to ask you something, he said, his voice calm but unyielding. Martha looked up from her glass of wine, her expression neutral. What is it? Do you know anything about Northfield Holdings? For a split second, her composure cracked. It was subtle, a slight widening of the eyes, a pause too long before she answered, but James caught it. No, she said, her tone measured. Why do you ask? James leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. Because their name is on the insurance documents from Emma's accident, and I think you do know something about them. Martha set down her glass, her movements slow and deliberate. James, you're spiraling. This obsession with Emma's accident, it's not healthy. You need to let it go. Let it go? James said, his voice rising. I saw a girl wearing Emma's necklace, a necklace that was supposed to be buried with her. I found inconsistencies in the reports, forged signatures, and now you're telling me to let it go? Martha's expression hardened. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. Then tell me, James demanded. Tell me what you know. For a moment, Martha said nothing. Then she stood, her face cold and unyielding. I'm trying to protect you, James, but if you keep digging, I won't be able to. With that, she left the room, leaving James alone with his racing thoughts. The next day, James received an unexpected call from Cassandra. I've been going through the documents again, she said. There's a name that keeps coming up. Janet Morgan. James frowned. Who's Janet Morgan? She worked for Northfield Holdings, Cassandra explained. I did some digging. Turns out, Morgan is Martha's maiden name. The revelation hit James like a thunderclap. He remembered seeing Martha's name on some of the paperwork, but he had assumed it was a coincidence. Now, it was clear she was more deeply involved than he had realized. James arranged to meet Cassandra that afternoon, and together they pored over the documents. The pieces were starting to fit together, but one critical question remained unanswered. Why? Why would Martha be involved in something like this? Cassandra asked, voicing the question that had been haunting James. I don't know, James admitted, but I'm going to find out. The following morning, James confronted Martha one final time. I know about Northfield Holdings, he said, his voice steady but firm. I know about Janet Morgan. I know you've been lying to me." Martha's face was a mask of indifference, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. "You don't understand, James," she said softly. "Then help me understand," James said. "Why? Why lie about Emma? What happened to her?" Martha hesitated, her hands trembling. Finally, she looked him in the eye and said, "Because she didn't die that night." James felt the world tilt beneath him. "What?" "She was taken," Martha said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know at first, but I found out later. They said it was for her own good, that she'd be safe." "Who?" James demanded. "Who took her?" Martha shook her head. "I can't tell you. If I do, they'll come for us, for all of us." James stared at her, his heart pounding. Everything he thought he knew had been a lie, and now he was closer than ever to the truth. But at what cost? Betty's face twisted in fury as she saw Frances Reed step forward. Her once perfect composure shattered, revealing the raw desperation of someone whose carefully crafted lies were unraveling. "You traitor," she spat, her voice venomous. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Francis stood firm, his posture shaking but resolute. "I'm doing the right thing. I won't let you ruin anyone else's life, Betty." The scene was chaotic. Police officers barked orders as they restrained Betty's hired men, cuffing them and leading them to the waiting patrol cars. Detective Weber approached Betty slowly, his hand resting on his holstered firearm. "Elizabeth Morgan Carter," Weber said, his voice calm but authoritative. "You are under arrest for fraud, child endangerment, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." Betty's grip on Mia tightened as she tried to pull the girl away, but Mia resisted, her small frame rooted in place. "No!" Betty screamed, her voice breaking as two officers grabbed her arms. "You don't understand. Everything I did was to protect her." Andrew stepped forward, his hands raised to calm the frightened child. "Mia," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "It's okay. You're safe now." The ruby necklace around Mia's neck gleamed in the afternoon sunlight as her wide eyes searched Andrew's face. Something in his voice, something in his presence, seemed to stir a memory buried deep within her. "You're," she began, her voice trembling. "You're my daddy?" Andrew's breath caught in his throat, his heart swelling with equal parts joy and sorrow. "Yes, sweetheart," he said, tears streaming down his face. "It's me. I've been looking for you for so long." Mia hesitated, her small hand clutching the ruby pendant tightly. Then, as if the weight of the moment became too much, she rushed into Andrew's arms, burying her face against his chest. Cassandra, standing a few steps behind, choked back a sob as she watched the reunion. She stepped forward and gently touched Mia's back. "It's Mommy, too," she said softly. "We're both here, Lily." Mia lifted her head, her tear-streaked face filled with confusion. "Lily?" Cassandra nodded, her voice trembling with emotion. "That's your real name, sweetheart. Lily Carter. We're your parents." Betty, now restrained and being led away by the officers, let out a desperate cry. "No, you can't take her. She's better off without you." Detective Weber turned to her sharply. "That's enough, Mrs. Carter. You've done enough damage." As the police car door slammed shut, silencing Betty's protests, the tension in the air began to dissipate. Andrew held Lily close, his arms wrapped protectively around her as if he feared she might disappear again. Hours later, the small conference room at the police station buzzed with quiet activity. Papers were being filed, evidence catalogued, and statements reviewed. Andrew and Cassandra sat with Lily between them, their hands gently clasping hers. "I don't understand," Lily said softly, her voice uncertain. "Why did she lie to me? Why did she say she was my mom?" Andrew's heart ached as he searched for the right words. "She was confused, sweetheart," he said gently. "She thought she was doing what was best for you, but she made a lot of wrong choices." "She wasn't your real mom," Cassandra added, her voice soothing. "We've always been your parents, Lily. We never stopped loving you." Detective Weber entered the room, his expression kind but serious. "We've confirmed through DNA testing that Mia is, in fact, Lily Carter," he said. "The evidence we've gathered against Betty is overwhelming. She'll be facing a long list of charges." Andrew nodded, his jaw tightening. "And Francis Reed? What happens to him?" "He'll testify against Betty," Weber replied. "Given his cooperation and the fact that he was coerced, the charges against him will likely be minimal. He's willing to do what it takes to make things right." Lily shifted in her chair, her small hand resting on the ruby necklace. "I remember her yelling a lot," she said quietly. "She would say I wasn't allowed to ask questions." Andrew exchanged a glance with Cassandra, their hearts breaking at the thought of what Lily had endured. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," Andrew said firmly, looking into Lily's eyes. "You're safe now. We're going to make sure of it." The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal proceedings, therapy sessions, and careful steps toward rebuilding their family. Lily's adjustment was slow but steady. She spent hours with Andrew and Cassandra, looking through old photo albums, hearing stories about her early childhood, and rediscovering the love she had once known. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Andrew sat with Lily on the porch swing. She was curled up beside him, the ruby necklace still hanging around her neck. "Why do I feel like I know this song?" Lily asked suddenly as Andrew hummed the familiar lullaby. Andrew smiled, his voice catching in his throat. "I used to sing it to you every night when you were little," he said. "Before—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Lily seemed to understand. "You can sing it again," she said, her voice soft, "if you want to." Tears welled in Andrew's eyes as he wrapped an arm around his daughter. "I'd like that," he whispered. Months later, the courtroom was filled with tense anticipation as Betty's trial began. Andrew and Cassandra sat in the front row, their presence a silent testament to their unwavering determination to see justice served. Francis Reed took the stand, his testimony detailing the night Betty brought Lily to the orphanage. "She told me to keep quiet," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "She said no one could ever know where the child came from." Detective Weber presented the forged documents, the falsified death certificate, and the insurance fraud evidence. Each piece painted a damning picture of Betty's web of lies. When the verdict was finally read, guilty on all charges, Andrew felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Justice had been served. As they left the courthouse, Lily held her parents' hands tightly, her ruby necklace glinting in the sunlight. She looked up at them and smiled, a real, genuine smile that brought tears to Andrew and Cassandra's eyes. "Are we going home now?" Lily asked. Andrew bent down, looking her in the eye. "Yes, sweetheart," he said. "We're going home. Together." Cassandra knelt beside them, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's face. "And we'll never let anything happen to you again," she promised. For the first time in years, their family felt whole. The ride home from the courthouse was quiet, but filled with a peaceful silence. Lily sat in the back seat, her small hands gripping the stuffed rabbit Cassandra had given her earlier that day. It wasn't her original rabbit, long lost in the years that had separated them, but she hugged it tightly, finding comfort in its softness. Andrew glanced at her through the rearview mirror. His heart swelled as he watched her quietly hum the lullaby he had sung the night before. It was as if fragments of the past were slowly stitching themselves back together. "Are we really safe now?" Lily asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence. Cassandra turned in her seat, her eyes soft but firm. "Yes, sweetie. No one is going to hurt us again." Lily nodded, though the shadows of uncertainty still lingered in her gaze. Andrew caught her eye in the mirror and gave her a reassuring smile. "We're safe," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for doubt. The suburban streets of their neighborhood came into view, and the house that Andrew had once regarded as a hollow shell now felt like the start of a new chapter. When they pulled into the driveway, The late afternoon sunlight bathed the house in a warm glow. As they stepped inside, Lily paused in the entryway, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar space. Andrew and Cassandra had decided to create a room for her in the heart of the house, filled with things that might make her feel more at home. "Would you like to see your room?" Cassandra asked gently. Lily hesitated, clutching the rabbit closer, but eventually nodded. Cassandra led her up the stairs, Andrew following close behind. The room was small but cozy, painted in soft pastels. A bookshelf lined one wall, filled with books carefully chosen by Andrew and Cassandra. Stories of courage, adventure, and love. On the bed was a handmade quilt, its colorful patches stitched together with care. Lily's eyes widened as she stepped inside. Her fingers trailed over the edges of the quilt, her expression a mix of wonder and trepidation. "This is all for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Andrew stepped forward, kneeling beside her. "Yes, sweetheart, it's all yours. This is your home now." Lily looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, wrapping her arms around his neck. Cassandra joined them, wrapping her arms around both of them. They stayed that way for a long time, the weight of everything they had endured finally giving way to a glimmer of hope. The following weeks were a mix of challenges and small victories. Lily's adjustment to her new life was slow but steady. She often woke up in the middle of the night, her small frame trembling from nightmares she couldn't articulate. Andrew would sit by her bedside, stroking her hair and softly humming the lullaby until her breathing evened out, and she drifted back to sleep. Cassandra, meanwhile, found ways to help Lily open up. They spent hours baking together in the kitchen, the smell of cookies and cakes filling the house. One day, as they kneaded dough side by side, Lily hesitated before saying, "She never baked with me. Betty, I mean." Cassandra paused, her hands stilling. "Well, we'll bake as much as you want," she said with a gentle smile. "Any recipe, any time." Lily smiled faintly. "Can we make chocolate cake next time?" "Absolutely," Cassandra said, her heart swelling. One evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Lily curled up on the couch between Andrew and Cassandra. The ruby necklace still hung around her neck, the pendant catching the flickering light of the fireplace. "Do you think she'll ever come back?" Lily asked suddenly, her voice quiet. Andrew and Cassandra exchanged a glance. They knew Lily was talking about Betty. "No," Andrew said softly but firmly. "She won't come back. The police made sure of that." "But what if she does?" Lily pressed, her wide eyes filled with worry. Cassandra reached for Lily's hand, holding it tightly. "If she ever tries to come near you again, we'll protect you. No matter what. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Lily nodded slowly, her grip on Cassandra's hand tightening. The seasons began to change, and with them, so did Lily. She began to smile more, her laughter filling the house in moments that Andrew and Cassandra cherished. She started asking questions about her past, about her life before the orphanage. Andrew and Cassandra answered as honestly as they could, balancing the truth with the need to protect her from the darker details of what had happened. One afternoon, as they walked through the local park, Lily stopped by the pond and crouched to watch the ducks. Andrew knelt beside her, a quiet smile on his face. "Daddy?" Lily asked, her voice thoughtful. "Yes, sweetheart?" "Do you think Grandma gave me this necklace for a reason?" She held up the ruby pendant, the sunlight dancing off its surface. Andrew's chest tightened as he considered her question. "I think Grandma wanted you to have something special," he said. "Something to remind you how much you're loved." Lily looked at him, her expression serious. "I think it worked," she said. Andrew blinked back tears, wrapping an arm around her. "Me too," he said. Back at home, Cassandra was in the kitchen when she heard Lily's laughter echoing from the living room. She paused, letting the sound wash over her. For so long, their lives had been defined by loss and grief. But now, in these moments, she felt something she hadn't dared to hope for. Peace. Andrew entered the kitchen, his face soft with the same emotion. "She's doing better," he said, his voice quiet. Cassandra nodded. "She's strong," she replied. "Stronger than we realized." They stood in silence for a moment before Cassandra turned to Andrew, her expression thoughtful. "We should tell her everything one day," she said, "when she's ready." Andrew hesitated but nodded. "When she's ready," he agreed. That night, as they tucked Lily into bed, she looked up at them with sleepy eyes. "Can you sing the song again?" she asked. Andrew smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Of course," he said. As he hummed the lullaby, Lily's eyes drifted shut, her small hand resting on the ruby pendant. Cassandra watched from the doorway, her heart full. When the song ended, Andrew leaned down and kissed Lily's forehead. "Good night, sweetheart," he whispered. "Good night, Daddy," Lily murmured, already half asleep. As Andrew and Cassandra stepped into the hallway, they paused to look back at the peaceful figure of their daughter. For the first time in years, their home felt whole again. Months later, on a bright spring morning, Andrew stood in the backyard watching Lily play with other children from the neighborhood. Her laughter rang out as she chased a butterfly across the lawn, her ruby necklace gleaming in the sunlight. Cassandra joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. "Look at her," she said softly, a smile tugging at her lips. Andrew nodded, his eyes never leaving Lily. "She's happy," he said, "really happy." "And so are we," Cassandra added, leaning against him. As they watched their daughter, the weight of the past finally began to lift. The road to this moment had been long and filled with pain, but standing here now, they knew it had all been worth it. Together, they had found their way back to hope. And to each other. The days turned into weeks, and the routine of normal life slowly returned to the Carter household. Yet for Andrew and Cassandra, normal now carried a deeper meaning. Every moment spent with Lily felt precious, whether it was a shared breakfast, a walk in the park, or a quiet evening at home. They had been given a second chance, and they were determined to make every day count. One rainy Saturday, Andrew sat at the kitchen table with Lily. The sound of raindrops tapping against the window filled the room as they worked together on a puzzle. It was a simple one, large pieces depicting a bright cartoon farm, but Lily approached it with a determination that made Andrew smile. "This piece goes here," Lily announced, her little hands holding a corner piece. She frowned for a moment, her brows furrowed in concentration, before finally fitting it into place. "See?" Andrew chuckled. "Perfect fit," he said, ruffling her hair. Lily looked up at him, her eyes bright. "Daddy, do you think we can frame it when it's done? I want to hang it in my room." Andrew nodded, his throat tightening at the simple joy in her request. "Of course, sweetheart. We'll frame it and hang it wherever you want." Cassandra entered the room, carrying a plate of warm chocolate chip cookies. "I heard there's serious puzzle work happening in here," she teased, setting the plate on the table. "Mommy, we're almost done," Lily exclaimed, grabbing a cookie and taking a big bite. "You can help with the last few pieces." Cassandra smiled and pulled up a chair, her heart swelling as she watched her daughter laugh and chatter. These quiet, unremarkable moments were what she had dreamed of during the long years of grief and uncertainty. As Lily settled into her new life, Andrew and Cassandra began looking for ways to help her reconnect with the world outside their home. One evening, while flipping through the community newsletter, Cassandra spotted an ad for a local children's art class. "Andrew," she said, holding up the newsletter, "what do you think about this? It's a beginner's art class at the recreation center. Lily loves to draw. Maybe it's something she'd enjoy." Andrew leaned over to look at the flyer. "That's a great idea," he agreed. "It could be good for her to meet other kids her age, too." The following Saturday, Cassandra took Lily to her first art class. The rec center was bustling with activity, parents chatting, kids running around, and the smell of fresh paint and glue filling the air. "Are you excited?" Cassandra asked as they walked down the hall to the classroom. Lily held her mother's hand tightly, her small face a mix of curiosity and nervousness. "What if I'm not good at it?" she asked. Cassandra knelt down, looking into her daughter's eyes. "Sweetie, you don't have to be good at it. You just have to have fun. That's the most important thing." Lily nodded slowly, and as they entered the classroom, her eyes widened at the sight of colorful supplies and cheerful drawings pinned to the walls. The teacher, a warm and friendly woman named Mrs. Hampton, greeted them with a bright smile. "You must be Lily," she said, kneeling to Lily's level. "I'm so glad you're here. We're going to have a lot of fun today." By the time the class ended, Lily was beaming. She proudly held up her first painting, a bright, abstract mix of colors, and handed it to Cassandra. "It's beautiful," Cassandra said, tears pricking her eyes. "We'll hang this in the living room." As Lily grew more comfortable in her new life, Andrew and Cassandra began tackling a question that had been weighing on them: what to tell Lily about her past. While they had answered her questions as they came, they knew the full story of her disappearance and Betty's involvement would need to be addressed eventually. One evening, as they tucked Lily into bed, she looked up at them with her usual curiosity. "Mommy? Daddy?" she asked, clutching her ruby necklace. "Yes, sweetheart," Andrew said, sitting on the edge of her bed. "Why didn't I live with you before?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Andrew and Cassandra exchanged a glance, their unspoken agreement clear. It was time. "Lily," Cassandra began gently, "there's a lot about your past that's very complicated, and some of it might be hard to understand right now. But the most important thing for you to know is that we've always loved you. We never stopped looking for you." Lily frowned slightly, her small hands playing with the pendant. "Betty said she was protecting me," she said. "Was that true?" Andrew's chest tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "She thought she was doing what was best, but it wasn't right, Lily. She made choices that hurt a lot of people, including you. And we're so sorry that you went through all of that." "Will she come back?" Lily asked, her voice tinged with fear. "No," Cassandra said firmly. "She won't. The police made sure of that." Lily seemed to think this over for a moment before nodding. "Okay," she said softly. Andrew leaned down and kissed her forehead. "We'll always protect you, sweetheart. Always." In the months that followed, Andrew and Cassandra worked hard to create a life filled with love, security, and new memories. They took family trips to the zoo, spent weekends hiking in nearby parks, and celebrated holidays with a newfound sense of gratitude. Lily's confidence blossomed. She made friends at her art class and even joined the school's summer soccer program, her laughter and energy bringing new life to the household. One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Lily looked up from her plate and said, "I want to invite my friends from art class over for a sleepover. Can we?" Andrew and Cassandra exchanged a smile. "Of course," Cassandra said. "We'll plan something fun." The sleepover was a success. The house was filled with giggles and the sound of little feet running up and down the stairs. As Andrew watched Lily lead her friends through the house, showing off her favorite toys and the framed puzzle they had completed together, he felt a deep sense of peace. On a warm summer evening, the Carters hosted a backyard barbecue for their neighbors and friends. It was their way of celebrating not only their family's reunion, but also the community that had supported them along the way. Detective Weber stopped by, his tie loosened and a smile on his face. "This is quite the gathering," he said as Andrew handed him a plate of food. "We have a lot to be grateful for," Andrew replied. Weber glanced over at Lily, who was playing tag with the other children. "She's doing well," he said. Andrew nodded, his heart full. "She's amazing. Stronger than I ever imagined." As the evening wore on, Andrew and Cassandra sat side by side, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. Lily ran over to them, her cheeks flushed and her eyes sparkling. "Come play," she said, grabbing their hands. Andrew and Cassandra laughed, letting her pull them toward the group of children. For the first time in years, they felt whole, together, happy and free from the shadows of the past. Their journey had been long and filled with heartache, but standing there, surrounded by love and laughter, they knew one thing for certain. They had found their way back to each other and to the life they were always meant to have. The sound of Mia's laughter still echoed in Andrew's mind as they drove home from the carousel that evening. In the back seat, Mia sat quietly, clutching the stuffed rabbit they had given her weeks ago. It had become her constant companion, a link to the memories she was slowly reclaiming. The ruby necklace caught the dim glow of the dashboard lights, reflecting faint red specks onto her small hands. Cassandra glanced at Andrew, her expression soft and filled with emotion. "Did you hear it?" she whispered. Andrew nodded, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. Her laugh. "It was Lily's," he said, his voice thick with feeling. They both turned to look at Mia, who was staring out the window, her expression distant but content. It was as if a part of her had come home today, a piece of her past slotting perfectly into place. As they pulled into the driveway, the house felt different somehow, lighter, as though the weight of grief and uncertainty that had haunted it for years was finally lifting. Andrew carried Mia to bed that night, her small frame heavy with sleep. Cassandra followed, tucking the quilt carefully around her and smoothing her hair. "Good night, sweetheart," Cassandra whispered, her voice trembling. Andrew lingered in the doorway for a moment, watching his daughter sleep. The soft rise and fall of her chest filled him with a peace he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that they might truly be a family again. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as Andrew flipped pancakes on the stove. The smell of butter and syrup filled the air, a comforting aroma that brought back memories of Sunday mornings long ago. Mia sat at the table, her legs swinging beneath her chair as she colored in a sketchbook Cassandra had given her. Her drawings were simple, flowers, animals, and bright suns with smiling faces, but each one was a testament to the growing sense of safety she felt in her new life. "Look, Daddy," Mia said, holding up her latest drawing. It was a picture of 3 figures, a man, a woman, and a little girl, standing under a rainbow. Andrew's throat tightened as he took the drawing. "It's beautiful, Lily," he said softly. Mia smiled, the name Lily now coming more naturally to her. She still used Mia at times, but it was clear she was beginning to embrace her true identity. Cassandra placed a plate of pancakes in front of Mia and kissed the top of her head. "You're quite the artist," she said. Mia beamed at the praise, her smile lighting up the room. Over the next few days, Andrew and Cassandra worked closely with Dr. Ruiz to support Mia's continued healing. The psychologist encouraged them to integrate more sensory experiences into their routines, such as playing Lily's favorite songs or cooking meals she had loved as a child. One afternoon, Cassandra found a dusty old box in the attic labeled Lily's keepsakes. She carried it down to the living room, where Andrew and Mia were playing a board game. "Look what I found," she said, setting the box on the coffee table. Mia's eyes widened with curiosity as Cassandra opened the lid. Inside were small treasures: a pair of tiny ballet slippers, a flower crown made of plastic daisies, and a framed photo of Lily holding a dandelion bouquet. "Is this me?" Mia asked, picking up the photo. Andrew sat beside her, his voice gentle. "Yes, that's you, Lily. You loved picking dandelions and bringing them to Mommy." Mia stared at the photo, her fingers tracing the edges. "I think I remember this," she said softly. The flowers smelled sweet. Cassandra knelt beside her, tears in her eyes. "You always called them wish flowers," she said. "You'd blow on them and make a wish." Mia looked up at her parents, a shy smile on her face. "Maybe we can pick some wish flowers together." Andrew and Cassandra exchanged a glance, their hearts swelling with hope. The trial against Betty Carter continued to progress, each new piece of evidence painting a clearer picture of her deception. Detective Weber worked tirelessly to ensure that every forged document and false statement was accounted for in the prosecution's case. In the courtroom, the tension was palpable as Francis Reed took the stand again to deliver his final testimony. His voice was steadier now, bolstered by the knowledge that his courage had helped bring the truth to light. She threatened me, Francis said, his gaze unwavering as he looked at the jury. She said if I ever told anyone about Mia's real identity, I'd regret it. She used money and power to control everything and everyone around her. The prosecutor displayed the forged death certificate on a large screen, highlighting the discrepancies that had gone unnoticed for years. This document, she said, her voice firm, is the foundation of Betty Carter's crimes. It represents the lengths she went to in order to cover up her actions. Betty sat at the defense table, her once polished demeanor now replaced with visible strain. Her attorney's arguments grew weaker with each passing day, and it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that her carefully constructed web of lies was unraveling. Back at home, Andrew and Cassandra focused on creating a sense of normalcy for Mia. They spent afternoons at the park, evenings playing board games, and weekends baking cookies together. Each moment was a step toward rebuilding the family they had lost. One night, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Mia leaned against Andrew's shoulder and asked, "Will Betty go to jail?" Andrew's heart ached at the question, but he answered honestly, "Yes, sweetheart. The police are making sure she can't hurt anyone else." Mia nodded, her small hand clutching his. "I'm glad," she said softly. Cassandra kissed the top of her head. "You're safe now, Lily. No one will ever take you away from us again." Mia looked up at them, her eyes shining with trust. "I know," she said, her voice steady. The day of the trial's closing arguments arrived, and Andrew and Cassandra sat in the courtroom, their hands tightly clasped. The prosecutor delivered a powerful speech reminding the jury of the evidence and the harm Betty had caused. "This is not just about fraud or forgery," the prosecutor said. "This is about a family torn apart, about a child robbed of her identity and her parents. Betty Carter's actions were deliberate, calculated, and deeply harmful. Justice must be served." When the jury returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts, Andrew and Cassandra felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The weight they had carried for years finally began to lift. As Betty was led away in handcuffs, her face pale and defeated, Andrew turned to Cassandra and whispered, "It's over." Cassandra nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We can finally move forward." That evening, the family returned home to find a package on their doorstep. Inside was a framed photo of the three of them at the carousel, a gift from Detective Weber. Andrew hung it on the living room wall, right next to the photos of Lily as a toddler. As they stood together, looking at the images of their journey, Mia reached up and held their hands. "I'm happy," she said simply. Andrew knelt beside her, his voice filled with emotion. "And we're happy too, sweetheart. More than you can ever know." The next few weeks were a blur of healing, adjustments, and small victories for the Carter family. Though the courtroom battle had ended, their journey as a family was far from over. Andrew and Cassandra poured their energy into creating an environment where Mia, now fully embracing her identity as Lily, could thrive. One rainy afternoon, Andrew sat with Lily at the kitchen table, teaching her how to fold paper cranes. The rhythmic movements of their hands created a soothing calm, the kind of peace that had been absent for far too long. "Why cranes?" Lily asked, her small hands fumbling with a sheet of bright pink paper. Andrew smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Cranes are a symbol of hope and healing," he said. "When I was younger, my mother taught me to fold them. She used to say that every crane carried a wish." Lily looked at the imperfect crane in her hand, her eyes narrowing as she focused on a crooked wing. "I'll make a wish," she said, her voice quiet but determined. "I'll wish that we're happy forever." Andrew's chest tightened, and he reached out to gently touch her hand. "That's a beautiful wish, Lily," he said. Meanwhile, Cassandra worked with Dr. Ruiz to create a memory book for Lily. It contained old photos, mementos, and handwritten notes that told the story of her early childhood. Cassandra spent hours curating the book, carefully balancing the need to help Lily reconnect with her past while ensuring the memories weren't overwhelming. One evening, Cassandra sat on the living room floor, the memory book open on the coffee table. Lily sat beside her, her eyes scanning the photos with growing curiosity. "This one was taken at the beach," Cassandra said, pointing to a picture of Lily as a toddler, her face smeared with chocolate ice cream. "You loved the water. You'd run straight toward the waves, laughing the whole way." Lily's brow furrowed, her fingers tracing the edges of the photo. "I don't remember that," she admitted. Cassandra wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "That's okay, sweetie. Memories take time. What matters is that we're making new ones now." Lily looked up at her, a shy smile tugging at her lips. "Can we go to the beach again someday?" "Of course," Cassandra said, her heart swelling. "We'll make it a family trip." At the same time, Andrew and Cassandra worked to integrate Lily back into a sense of community. They enrolled her in a local art class and arranged playdates with children from the neighborhood. Slowly but surely, Lily began to open up, her laughter becoming more frequent, her steps more confident. One Saturday morning, the family attended a community festival in the park. Booths lined the pathways, offering everything from handmade crafts to face painting. The air was filled with the cheerful hum of conversation and the scent of roasted peanuts and kettle corn. Lily tugged on Andrew's sleeve, her eyes wide with excitement. "Can I get my face painted, Daddy?" Andrew chuckled. "Of course," he said. She sat patiently as a young artist painted a delicate butterfly across her cheek. When it was finished, she turned to Cassandra with a grin. "Do I look like a butterfly?" "You look beautiful," Cassandra said, her voice filled with love. Later, as they strolled past a booth selling framed photographs, one image caught Lily's attention. A close-up of a single dandelion, its fluffy seeds captured in mid-flight. "Wish flowers?" Lily whispered, her fingers brushing the edge of the frame. Andrew knelt beside her. "Would you like to take it home?" he asked. Lily nodded, her eyes shimmering with emotion. Back at home, the framed photograph found its place on Lily's bedroom wall, a symbol of the hope and resilience that had carried their family through their darkest days. As the days turned into weeks, Lily's bond with her parents deepened. She began to call Andrew Daddy and Cassandra Mommy without hesitation, her words carrying a weight of trust and love. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, Lily looked up from her coloring book and asked, "Did I have a favorite song when I was little?" Andrew and Cassandra exchanged a glance, their hearts swelling. "You loved Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," Cassandra said. Lily tilted her head. "Can you sing it for me?" Andrew cleared his throat, his voice unsteady with emotion as he began to sing. Cassandra joined in, their voices blending in a soft lullaby. Lily listened intently, her eyes growing heavy as the familiar melody washed over her. "I think I remember this," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. Andrew kissed her forehead as Cassandra tucked the quilt around her. "Good night, sweetheart," they said in unison. Across town, Detective Weber continued to tie up loose ends from the case. He visited Francis Reed at the safe house where he had been staying under police protection. "How are you holding up?" Weber asked, his tone kind but professional. Francis shifted in his chair, his posture less tense than it had been weeks ago. "Better," he admitted. "It feels good to know the truth is out there now." Weber nodded. "You did the right thing, Francis. What you shared made all the difference." Francis hesitated, then said, "I just hope the little girl, Lily, I hope she's happy now." Weber's expression softened. "She is. Her parents are doing everything they can to make up for lost time." Francis nodded, a faint smile on his face. "Good," he said. "She deserves that." As summer turned to fall, the Carters found themselves settling into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. Family dinners, school projects, and lazy Sunday mornings became the backdrop of their lives. One crisp autumn afternoon, they visited an orchard to pick apples. The rows of trees stretched endlessly under a clear blue sky, their branches heavy with bright red fruit. Lily ran ahead, her laughter echoing through the orchard. Andrew and Cassandra followed, their hands clasped as they watched their daughter climb a low-hanging branch to reach for an apple. "Got it!" Lily called out, holding the fruit aloft like a trophy. Andrew laughed, his chest swelling with pride. "That's my girl," he said. Later, as they sat under a tree eating warm apple cider donuts, Lily leaned against Cassandra and said, "I like being here with you." Cassandra kissed the top of her head. "We like being here with you too, Lily," she said softly. The family's journey was far from over, but each day brought them closer to a future filled with love, laughter, and the unshakable bond they had fought so hard to rebuild. As autumn deepened, the Carters continued finding ways to celebrate their new beginning as a family. One Saturday morning, they visited a pumpkin patch on the outskirts of town. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of cinnamon and hay, and orange pumpkins of every shape and size blanketed the fields. "Lily, look at this one," Cassandra called, pointing to a lopsided pumpkin that was leaning heavily to one side. Lily giggled and skipped over to it. "It's funny looking," she said, crouching down to touch its bumpy surface. "I like it." "Then it's yours," Andrew said with a smile. He hoisted the pumpkin onto his shoulder, earning an admiring look from his daughter. They spent the afternoon carving their pumpkins at home, scooping out seeds and laughing at their less-than-perfect designs. Lily's creation, a crooked-toothed jack-o'-lantern, earned a prominent spot on the porch, where it glowed warmly in the evening light. As they lit the candles inside their pumpkins, Lily looked up at Andrew and Cassandra, her face glowing in the flickering light. "This is my favorite day ever," she said softly. Andrew knelt beside her, his voice full of emotion. "Every day with you is our favorite, Lily." Later that evening, as the family sat together in the living room, Lily asked a question that had clearly been on her mind for some time. "Will we always stay together?" she asked, her voice hesitant but filled with hope. Andrew and Cassandra exchanged a glance, their hearts aching at the vulnerability in her words. "Always," Cassandra said firmly, pulling Lily into her lap. "No one will ever take you away from us again." Lily rested her head against Cassandra's chest, her small hands clutching the ruby necklace that still hung around her neck. "I like being here," she whispered. Andrew reached over to touch Lily's hand, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "This is your home, sweetheart. You're exactly where you're meant to be." Across town, Detective Weber continued to work on wrapping up the legal proceedings surrounding Betty Carter's case. Though the trial was over, new details about Betty's crimes continued to emerge. During a meeting with the district attorney, Weber reviewed a stack of financial records that showed how Betty had funneled money into various accounts in an attempt to cover her tracks. "She didn't just want control," Weber said, shaking his head. "She wanted power, enough to manipulate everyone around her." The district attorney nodded grimly. "Her sentencing hearing is next week. With everything we've uncovered, she won't have much room for leniency." As Weber left the meeting, he thought of Andrew, Cassandra, and Lily. Though his job often required him to remain detached, he couldn't help but feel a personal stake in their story. They had fought so hard to reclaim their family, and he was determined to ensure that justice for them was served. On the day of Betty's sentencing hearing, Andrew and Cassandra sat quietly in the courtroom, their hands tightly clasped. Lily was not with them. Detective Weber had arranged for her to stay with Dr. Ruiz during the hearing to shield her from the stress of the proceedings. Betty entered the courtroom with her head held high, but her polished demeanor was no longer convincing. There was a hollowness in her eyes, a sign that she knew her carefully constructed life had come crashing down. When the judge handed down her sentence, 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole for the first 15, Andrew felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was finally over. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered once again, their microphones thrust forward as they asked questions about the sentencing. "Justice was served today," Andrew said simply, his voice steady. "Now we can focus on what truly matters, our family." That evening, As Andrew and Cassandra picked up Lily from Dr. Ruiz's office, the little girl ran into their arms with a wide smile. "How did it go?" she asked, looking up at them with curious eyes. "It's all taken care of," Cassandra said, kneeling down to hug her tightly. "Now we can move forward." Lily nodded, her smile softening into something more thoughtful. "Good," she said. "I don't want to think about her anymore." "You don't have to," Andrew assured her, lifting her into his arms. "We're moving on together." In the months that followed, the Carters found joy in the simple moments that made up their days. Family dinners, lazy mornings, and spontaneous adventures became the foundation of their new life. One snowy afternoon, they decided to build a snowman in the backyard. Lily directed the operation, insisting that the snowman have a scarf and a top hat just like the ones in her storybooks. When the snowman was complete, Lily clapped her hands and laughed. "He looks perfect." Andrew and Cassandra exchanged a smile, their hearts full as they watched their daughter's happiness bloom. Later, as they sat by the fire sipping hot chocolate, Lily looked up at them with a serious expression. "Are you happy?" she asked. Andrew leaned forward, his voice filled with sincerity. "Happier than I've ever been." "Me too," Lily said, snuggling between them on the couch. Cassandra kissed the top of her head, her voice soft but steady. "This is all we've ever wanted," she said, "to be together." As spring arrived, the family planned their first vacation together, a trip to the beach. When they arrived, the salty breeze and the sound of crashing waves brought a sense of peace that felt almost magical. Lily ran toward the water, her laughter ringing out as the waves lapped at her feet. Andrew and Cassandra followed, their hands intertwined as they watched their daughter revel in the simple joy of the moment. "This is perfect," Cassandra said, leaning her head against Andrew's shoulder. "It is," Andrew agreed, his gaze fixed on Lily. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, the Carters stood together on the shore, their silhouettes framed by the fading light. Lily reached up to take their hands, her small voice carrying above the sound of the waves. "Thank you for finding me," she said. Andrew's throat tightened, and he knelt to hug her. "We never stopped looking," he said. "Not for a single moment." Cassandra joined the embrace, tears streaming down her face. In that moment, they knew they had truly come full circle. The morning after their beach trip, Lily woke early, the sound of seagulls calling outside her window. She stretched and padded softly into the kitchen, where Andrew was already making breakfast. The scent of fresh coffee and scrambled eggs filled the air. "Morning, Daddy," Lily said, her voice still tinged with sleep. Andrew turned, his face lighting up with a smile. "Morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep well?" Lily nodded, climbing onto a stool at the counter. "Can we go back to the beach today?" "Of course," Andrew said, setting a plate of toast in front of her. "But first, how about we eat and pack some snacks for later?" Cassandra appeared moments later, her hair tousled from sleep. She kissed Lily on the top of her head and smiled at Andrew. "What's the plan for today?" "More beach adventures," Andrew said, handing her a cup of coffee. Lily grinned, her excitement palpable. "Can we build a sandcastle? A big one?" "As big as you want," Cassandra said, her eyes sparkling. The day unfolded in a series of joyful moments. At the beach, Andrew and Cassandra helped Lily build a sandcastle with intricate towers and a moat that filled with water whenever a wave lapped at the shore. Lily worked diligently, her little hands shaping the sand as she hummed softly to herself. Occasionally, she would pause to run to the water's edge, splashing and laughing as the cool waves washed over her feet. Andrew watched her with a mixture of pride and wonder. Every smile, every laugh, every carefree moment was a reminder of how far they had come. Later, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, the family gathered around a bonfire on the beach. The flames crackled and popped, casting a warm glow over their faces. Cassandra pulled a blanket around Lily's shoulders as Andrew roasted marshmallows over the fire. "Tell me a story," Lily said, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. Andrew and Cassandra exchanged a glance, and Cassandra nodded. Andrew began, his voice soft and rhythmic. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who loved dandelions. She called them wish flowers and believed they could make all her dreams come true. One day, the wind carried her away to a far-off place, but her parents never stopped searching for her. They followed every clue, chased every hope, until one day they found her again. And together they made new wishes and built a life full of love. Lily's eyes grew heavy as she listened, her small body relaxing against Cassandra's side. "That's a good story," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "It's our story," Cassandra whispered, kissing her daughter's forehead. The following weeks brought more milestones for Lily. She started school again, attending a small, supportive class where she quickly made friends. Her teacher, Mrs. Peterson, was kind and patient, encouraging Lily to express herself through art and storytelling. One day, Lily came home clutching a handmade card. "It's for you," she said, holding it out to Andrew and Cassandra. The card was decorated with crayon drawings of their family, 3 figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Inside, Lily had written in careful letters, "Thank you for finding me. I love you." Andrew's eyes filled with tears as he read the words. Cassandra hugged Lily tightly, her heart overflowing with love. "We love you too," Cassandra said softly, "more than anything in the world." As the seasons changed, so did the rhythm of their lives. Fall brought trips to pumpkin patches and evenings spent raking leaves into piles for Lily to jump into. Winter brought snowball fights, warm cocoa, and cozy nights by the fire. Through it all, Lily continued to grow more confident, more secure in her identity as part of their family. She began sharing memories of her time at the orphanage, small glimpses of her life before she was found. "It was lonely," she said one evening as they sat by the fire. "But I always felt like someone was looking for me, like I wasn't really alone." Andrew's heart ached at her words, but he reached out to take her hand. "You were never alone, Lily," he said. "We were always looking for you." Lily leaned against him, her small body warm and trusting. "I know," she said softly. One day in early spring, Andrew and Cassandra decided to visit the old neighborhood where they had lived when Lily was a toddler. They wanted to show her the places that had once been a part of her life. As they walked through the familiar streets, Lily held tightly to both their hands. "Do you remember this park?" Cassandra asked as they passed a small playground. "You used to love the swings." Lily paused, her eyes scanning the playground. "I think I do," she said slowly. "I remember flying really high like a bird." Andrew smiled, his heart swelling. "That's right. You always wanted to go higher." They stopped by the duck pond, where Lily tossed breadcrumbs to the waiting ducks. A sense of peace settled over them as they watched the gentle ripples on the water. "This feels nice," Lily said, her voice quiet but content. "It does," Cassandra agreed, wrapping an arm around her daughter's shoulders. By summer, the Carters had settled into a life that felt whole and complete. They celebrated Lily's birthday with a small party, inviting her new friends and their families. The backyard was filled with laughter, balloons, and the smell of grilled hot dogs. As Lily blew out the candles on her cake, Andrew and Cassandra stood beside her, their hands resting on her shoulders. "What did you wish for?" Cassandra asked, as the smoke curled from the extinguished candles. Lily smiled, her eyes sparkling. "I wished that we'd always stay together." Andrew's throat tightened, and he knelt to hug her. "That's one wish I can promise will come true," he said. As the evening drew to a close and the guests began to leave, Lily sat on the porch steps watching the fireflies dance in the warm summer air. Andrew and Cassandra joined her sitting on either side. "Do you remember when we went to the carousel?" Lily asked suddenly. Andrew nodded. "I do. That was a special day." Lily tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "It felt like I was finding something I'd lost for a long time." Cassandra wrapped an arm around her. "You found us?" she said softly. "And we found you?" Lily leaned against her, a contented smile on her face. "I'm glad," she said. The three of them sat together in the quiet, their hearts full of gratitude and love. In that moment, they knew they had finally come home, not just to a house, but to each other. And so the Carters' story became one of hope, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds of family. Though their journey had been long and filled with challenges, they had emerged stronger, their love shining brighter than ever. As they looked toward the future, they knew one thing for certain. No matter what lay ahead, they would face it together,